The audience was silent, their eyes locked onto the stage as the bright studio lights illuminated the two figures seated across from each other. It was meant to be just another interview, another routine conversation, but no one was prepared for what was about to unfold. The host, a well-known television personality with a reputation for pushing hard-hitting questions, leaned forward with a smirk, ready to put Melania Trump in the hot seat. He had done his research, crafted his words carefully, and believed he was about to make headlines. But what happened next left everyone in the room stunned. Melania sat with her signature grace, her beige suit perfectly tailored, her expression calm and unreadable. She had faced countless interviews before, endured endless scrutiny, but she was not someone who allowed herself to be rattled easily. As the cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face, the host finally asked the question he had been saving, the one he was sure would spark controversy. "So, Melania," he began, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension, "do you ever regret marrying Donald Trump?" The audience gasped, some whispering to each other in disbelief. It was the kind of question designed not for insight, but for spectacle, for the kind of viral moment that would dominate social media. The host knew exactly what he was doing. He was expecting hesitation, awkwardness, maybe even a defensive response. Instead, Melania simply tilted her head slightly, a flicker of amusement crossing her face before she leaned forward. There was a long pause. The host was waiting, the audience was waiting, the world was waiting. And then, with a tone that was both firm and composed, she finally spoke. "You seem very interested in my marriage," she said smoothly, her accent adding weight to every word. "But tell me, do you ask every woman this question, or just the ones married to Donald Trump?" The audience erupted. Some gasped, others laughed, while the host shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard. He had expected to be in control of the conversation. But in a matter of seconds, Melania had flipped the script. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't shaken. Instead, she had put the question right back on him, exposing the bias beneath it. The host tried to recover, chuckling as he adjusted his tie. "Well, it's just that your husband is a very unique figure," he replied, still attempting to steer the narrative. "People are curious about your perspective." Melania nodded, as if considering his words, before delivering another response that no one saw coming. "My perspective," she echoed, her voice unwavering. "I think people are more curious about why the media always underestimates me." The room was electric. The host had walked into this interview believing he was in charge, but now it was clear. Melania had come prepared. She wasn't here to be dissected, judged, or manipulated into playing into the media's expectations. She was here to speak on her own terms. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. The audience, whether they supported her or not, couldn't deny what they were witnessing. This wasn't the quiet, reserved woman the media often painted her to be. This was someone who knew exactly how to handle pressure, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the narrative being spun around her. The host, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to redirect the conversation. "Well, I think people just want to know more about the real you," he said, offering a forced smile. "You've been in the public eye for so long, and yet some would say you remain a mystery." Melania allowed a small smile, but her eyes remained sharp. "Being private does not mean being weak," she said simply. "It means choosing what deserves my attention." Another murmur rippled through the audience. She wasn't just answering questions, she was making a statement. The host had expected to corner her, but instead, she had taken full control of the conversation. He was left scrambling, unsure of how to regain the upper hand. But just as he opened his mouth to speak again, Melania leaned back in her chair, her expression still composed, but her next words hinting at something even bigger. something no one had been expecting. And at that moment, everyone in the studio knew. The real show was just getting started. The air in the studio remained thick with anticipation. The host, still recovering from Melania's unexpected turn of control, forced a polite smile as he shuffled his notes. He was known for being quick on his feet, able to redirect conversations with ease. But this was different. She had come prepared. She wasn't flustered, she wasn't defensive. She was deliberate, composed, and unshaken. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion. The host knew he had to regain command of the interview before it slipped completely from his grasp. He leaned in, lowering his voice slightly, as if to create a more intimate setting. Melania, many people feel that during your time as First Lady, you stayed in the background. Do you think you missed an opportunity to use your voice more? Melania's lips parted slightly, and for a brief moment, she simply studied him. The silence stretched just long enough to make him shift in his seat again. Then, with measured confidence, she spoke. I used my voice in the way that mattered. Just because I did not scream does not mean I was silent. A murmur rippled through the audience. The host blinked, clearly thrown off by the weight of her words. He had expected her to be passive, to dodge the question or offer a polished, rehearsed response. Instead, she had met him head-on, making it clear that she would not be defined by the media's perception of her. But don't you think, the host pressed, trying to maintain his position, that people wanted to see you take a stronger stance on the issues? Melania's expression remained poised, but there was a sharpness in her gaze now. Stronger, she repeated, almost as if testing the word. Stronger according to who? The media. People who never truly listened, only judged. She paused, letting the weight of her response settle. I did not need to perform for headlines. I focused on actions, not attention. The audience was hanging on her every word. For years, people had speculated about her thoughts, about her role, about whether she had truly embraced her position or simply endured it. But now, in this very moment, she was making one thing crystal clear. She had always been in control of her own narrative. The host, now visibly realizing that his usual tactics weren't working, changed direction again. You Be Best initiative focused on children's well-being, but there were many critics who felt it was overshadowed by your husband's presence. Did that ever frustrate you? Melania exhaled softly, as if considering how much she wanted to reveal. I started Be Best because I care about the well-being of children. I did not need approval from critics to do the work. She folded her hands in her lap, her tone unwavering. The media focused on controversy. I focused on helping. The host hesitated, and for the first time since the interview began, he seemed unsure of his next move. He had underestimated her. He had expected short, simple answers, maybe a few careful deflections. But what he got instead was someone who wasn't afraid to push back. Sensing the shift, he decided to take another approach, one that he thought might catch her off guard. You've seen firsthand the political divide in this country. How do you feel about the way your husband is perceived today? The question lingered in the air. The audience sat up straighter. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment where she might either defend or distance herself. But Melania, as always, remained impossible to predict. My husband is a strong man, she said carefully, her voice even. People will always have opinions. That is their right. But I know the man behind the headlines. The host pressed further. And what do you think people misunderstand the most about him? Melania studied him for a long moment before answering. That he does not care. She let the words settle before continuing. He fights for what he believes in. That is something people do not always see. The host nodded, sensing that he had reached as far as he could on that topic. But he still had one more card to play. He leaned back slightly, his tone shifting. If you had the chance to go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still step into this life? The audience collectively held their breath. It was a question loaded with implication. He was asking if she regretted it all, if she regretted the scrutiny, the criticisms, the endless speculation. And for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her expression. Not hesitation, but reflection. Finally, she smiled, but there was something knowing behind it. Life is not about looking back, she said smoothly. It is about standing strong in the choices you make. The room was silent. The host had been hoping for a different kind of response, something that could be turned into a dramatic headline. Instead, he had received an answer that, once again, left no room for doubt. She had made her choices, and she was not someone who lived with regrets. The tension in the studio remained thick as the interview continued. There were still questions left to be asked, but one thing had already become clear. This was not the conversation the host had planned. Melania Trump had walked onto that stage with quiet confidence, and one by one, she had dismantled every assumption about her. And yet, even with everything she had said, there was still something unspoken lingering beneath the surface. Something that made everyone in the room wonder if she was holding back the most surprising response of all. The air in the studio remained charged with unspoken tension. The host, though maintaining his professional composure, was visibly aware that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. He had come prepared with questions designed to challenge, to put Melania in a position where she might falter or offer something that could turn into a viral moment. But instead, she had countered every single attempt with unwavering confidence. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't played into emotion, yet somehow she had commanded the entire room. As the cameras kept rolling, the host made a subtle shift in strategy. If she wouldn't be shaken by direct confrontation, perhaps a more personal approach would open a door. He softened his tone, giving the illusion of an earnest discussion. Melania, many people have speculated about what life was really like for you behind the scenes. The pressures, the expectations. Was it ever overwhelming? She took a breath, her expression momentarily unreadable. For the first time, there was the slightest pause before she spoke. Pressure is part of life. Everyone faces expectations, but how you handle them is what defines you. She glanced toward the audience, then back at the host. I do not let pressure control me. I focus on what is important. The response was careful, but not dismissive. The audience could sense that there was more beneath the surface, but Melania was not someone who would easily be drawn into revealing what she did not wish to share. The host, sensing the opportunity to push just a little further, continued. And what was important to you during those years? A hint of something flickered in her eyes, an emotion that wasn't quite readable. My family, my work, and staying true to myself. The simplicity of her answer was striking. In a world where people often felt the need to over-explain or justify, she chose restraint. But that only deepened the intrigue. The host leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if inviting her into a moment of real honesty. But surely there were moments where you felt the weight of everything. Moments where you wished things had gone differently. Melania held his gaze, her expression unwavering. Everyone has difficult moments, she acknowledged. But I do not live in the past. I look forward. The audience remained still, hanging on to every word. There was an undeniable mystery to the way she answered. She wasn't avoiding the truth. She was simply refusing to let anyone else define it for her. Sensing that this line of questioning would not lead to the dramatic revelation he was hoping for, the host shifted once again. Let's talk about public perception, he said. Your time in the White House was filled with a lot of speculation. People often tried to read into your expressions, your body language. They created their own narratives about you. Did that ever frustrate you? Melania let out a soft breath, not quite a sigh, but something close. People will always see what they want to see. That is the world we live in. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. But I know who I am, and that is what matters. There was something incredibly deliberate about her choice of words. She wasn't defensive, nor was she dismissive. Instead, she spoke with a quiet certainty that made it clear she had long since come to terms with how the world viewed her. The host, realizing that she had no interest in playing into controversy, tried one more approach. Your initiative, Be Best, was something you were deeply passionate about, but it often seemed overshadowed by political noise. Do you feel it got the recognition it deserved? For the first time, something in her expression changed. There was a hint of steel in her gaze now, a quiet but unmistakable firmness. Be Best was never about recognition. It was about impact, and I know the impact it had. The host blinked, slightly taken aback by the certainty in her voice. But do you feel the media was unfair in how they covered it? Melania's lips pressed together briefly before she answered. Media covers what they want. That is their choice. But I focus on the work, not the coverage. There it was again, that quiet defiance, the refusal to let herself be pulled into a debate over what had or hadn't been fair. The audience murmured, sensing that despite the host's best efforts, he was unable to shake her. She wasn't here to settle scores. She wasn't here to complain. She was here to make one thing clear. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be defined by outside voices. The host exhaled slightly, sitting back in his chair. He had interviewed countless public figures before, but this was something different. There was no emotional outburst, no dramatic moment of confession. And yet, the intensity in the room was undeniable. Realizing that time was running out, he made one final attempt to elicit something unexpected. Melania, if you could say one thing to those who misunderstood you, to those who judged without knowing, what would it be? For a brief moment, silence filled the space. The audience leaned in. Even the host seemed to hold his breath, waiting. Melania, still composed, simply met his gaze and said, "I do not need to explain myself. People will believe what they want, and I will continue to live my life." The impact of her words was immediate. There was no plea for understanding, no attempt to rewrite the past. She had spoken her truth, not in long explanations, but in absolute certainty. The host, sensing that this was the closest he would get to an answer, nodded slowly. He had pushed, he had prodded, but in the end it was clear. Melania Trump was a woman who refused to be defined by anyone other than herself. And as the camera zoomed in on her face, still calm, still unreadable, the audience knew one thing for sure. She had just taken control of the entire narrative, and there was nothing anyone could do to change it. The studio remained eerily silent for a moment after Melania's last words. Even the host, who had spent his entire career navigating tense interviews, seemed momentarily at a loss. He had expected pushback, perhaps even frustration, but what he got was something far more unsettling, an unshakable calm. It wasn't the reaction he had anticipated, and judging by the murmurs rippling through the audience, they hadn't expected it either. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every nuance of the moment. Melania sat poised, her expression unchanged, as if she had been expecting every single question. There was no defensiveness, no need to justify herself. And in that stillness, a quiet power radiated from her. The host knew he had one last shot at reclaiming control of the conversation. He took a breath, adjusting in his chair. "Melania, you've been in the public eye for years, yet you've always remained somewhat of a mystery. Many have speculated about what you truly think, how you truly feel. If this is your opportunity to set the record straight, what do you want people to know? Melania met his gaze, but for the first time, something almost imperceptible shifted in her expression. Was it amusement? Annoyance? The audience couldn't quite tell. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice even, but carrying a quiet force. I do not need to set the record straight. People will believe what they want. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the host seemed uncertain about how to proceed. He had spent the entire interview trying to peel back layers, trying to push her into a moment of raw emotion. But instead, she had controlled the narrative with a kind of restraint he hadn't encountered before. Realizing he needed a different angle, he decided to push one final time. You've always maintained that you stay out of politics. But surely, after everything you've seen and experienced, you must have an opinion on how the media, the public, and even Washington itself have treated you. The audience held their breath. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. A chance for her to say something that would make headlines, to finally reveal her true thoughts. The tension in the room was electric. Melania took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his. Opinion does not change reality. I know what is true. The response was simple, yet it held so much weight. She wasn't playing into the trap. She wasn't offering up an easy soundbite that could be twisted and used against her. She was standing firm in the one thing no one could take away from her, her own truth. The host let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly. You really don't let anyone get to you, do you? A small smile ghosted across Melania's lips, the first hint of anything resembling amusement. No, she said simply. The audience erupted into whispers. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't made any grand declarations. And yet, somehow, she had just delivered the most powerful moment of the entire interview. The host knew it too. He could see it slipping away from him, the chance to control the direction of this conversation. He tried one last time. If there's one thing you want people to take away from this conversation, what would it be? Melania's expression remained composed, but her answer came without hesitation. That I am not who they say I am. The words landed with impact, sending a ripple through the audience. The host sat back, nodding slowly, as if realizing there was nothing more he could do. He had tried every tactic, but she had remained unshaken, unbroken. And in doing so, she had just rewritten the entire story. The cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing every detail of the moment. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and now there was only one question left. What would happen next? Just as the audience thought the conversation had reached its peak, the host shifted in his seat, glancing down at his notes with a knowing smirk. It was subtle, but enough to signal that he had something else up his sleeve. The tension in the room didn't ease. It shifted, almost as if the air had thickened with anticipation. He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly, making it feel more intimate and more pointed. Melania, you say you are not who they say you are. But let me ask you this. Why do you think the public struggles to see the real you? For the first time, Melania hesitated. It wasn't hesitation out of fear or uncertainty, but a calculated pause, as if carefully considering how much to reveal. The audience was hooked, waiting, barely breathing. Then, just as she opened her mouth to respond, the host interrupted. Because maybe they don't believe the real you even exists. The words landed with a quiet force, cutting through the polished atmosphere of the interview. The energy shifted again, but this time it was unpredictable. Murmurs stirred in the audience. The host's tone had changed, subtly but noticeably. This wasn't just a hard-hitting question. This was an attempt to unravel something deeper. Melania blinked once, twice, her expression unreadable. But then, instead of reacting defensively, she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a forced, uncomfortable laugh, but a genuine, soft chuckle. It was brief, but it completely disrupted the tension. The host faltered for just a second, clearly not expecting that response. She tilted her head slightly, looking at him with quiet amusement. "And yet, here I am," she said, her voice as steady as ever. The host recovered quickly, though. He wasn't about to let this moment slip away. But do you ever feel like a character in someone else's story? Like no matter what you do, the world has already decided who you are. For a brief second, something flashed in Melania's eyes, something unspoken, something real. It was gone just as quickly as it appeared, but those paying close attention noticed. She let out a small breath, the only indication that the question had stirred something in her. "I think everyone in the public eye feels that way," she admitted, her tone still composed but slightly softer. "But I do not let it define me." The host wasn't satisfied. He saw a crack, and he wanted to pry it open. But surely after years of scrutiny, after being placed under a microscope, there must have been a moment where you wanted to break free from it all. A moment where you questioned if it was worth it. The silence that followed was heavy. This was different. This wasn't about politics or media narratives or public perception. This was personal. The audience leaned in, sensing something bigger unfolding. The host's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp, waiting, watching. Melania could feel it. And for the first time, a question seemed to truly sit with her. She exhaled, slow and deliberate. Wanting to break free and actually breaking are two different things. The response was layered. It wasn't a yes, it wasn't a no. It was something more complicated, something more human. And the fact that she didn't offer up a neatly packaged answer only made it more powerful. The host, sensing that this was the closest he was going to get to something raw, decided to push just a little further. "If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still choose this life?" A bold question, a dangerous question. The room was completely still, waiting. Melania's expression didn't change at first. But then, after what felt like an eternity, she met his gaze and delivered the most unexpected answer of all. "I never chose this life," she said simply. "It chose me." And with that, the interview had taken a turn no one had seen coming. The air in the studio was thick with anticipation. The host, usually so confident and in control, seemed momentarily caught off guard. He had expected a yes or a no, something definitive, something he could challenge. But instead, Melania had given him an answer that was both simple and profound. It wasn't what anyone had expected, and that made it even more powerful. For a brief moment, the host hesitated. He could feel the shift in the room. The audience was no longer just watching an interview. They were witnessing something real, something unscripted. He had spent the entire conversation trying to push her into a corner, but now it was as if she had turned the entire game around without ever raising her voice. Melania sat poised, her hands resting gracefully on her lap, her expression unreadable. The host glanced down at his notes, as if searching for something to regain his advantage. Then, as if deciding to take one last shot, he straightened up and spoke. "But don't you think, at some point, we all have a choice?" He asked carefully. "Even if the life chooses us, we decide how we live it." A small smile played on Melania's lips. It wasn't mocking or dismissive. If anything, it was knowing. She leaned in just slightly, her voice calm but firm. "And I have made my choice. That is why I am here today, speaking for myself." The audience murmured. It was clear she wasn't just talking about the interview. She was talking about everything, the media, the scrutiny, the years of speculation. In that single statement, she had taken back control of her own narrative. The host opened his mouth, ready to respond, but before he could, something unexpected happened. One of the producers, sitting just off camera, suddenly received a note. His expression shifted, and within seconds, there was a flurry of quiet movement behind the scenes. The studio's energy changed, a subtle but undeniable sense that something bigger was unfolding in real time. The host, sensing the shift, glanced toward the production crew, but quickly turned his attention back to Melania. He wasn't about to lose the moment. So to be clear, he pressed, "You have no regrets." Melania took a breath, her gaze steady. "Regret is for those who live in the past. I choose to live in the present." The audience erupted into applause, catching even the host off guard. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He had tried to frame the conversation as a battle, but Melania had never played into it. Instead, she had controlled the narrative in a way that left him with no room to push further. But just as the applause settled, a voice came through the earpiece the host was wearing. He stiffened. The producer whispered something to him, and his eyes widened slightly. Something was happening. Trying to maintain composure, he turned back to Melania, his expression unreadable. "It seems we have some breaking news," he announced, his voice controlled but tense. "And I think you'll find this particularly interesting." The room fell silent. The tension, which had already been high, now reached an entirely new level. The host took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the stack of notes in front of him. "We're receiving reports that—" He hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to proceed. Then finally he continued. "It appears there's been a major development regarding, well, something that directly involves you." Melania didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed almost expectant, as if she had already anticipated this moment. The audience, on the other hand, was visibly tense. What was happening? What had the producers just learned? The host's voice was measured, but there was no denying the gravity in his tone. "We are being told that a statement has just been released, one that challenges everything that has been said about you in the last several years." A beat of silence. The tension was unbearable. Melania tilted her head slightly, waiting. The host exhaled. "Would you like to respond?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. But without missing a beat, Melania gave the same composed smile she had worn throughout the entire interview. Then, in a voice that was both quiet and commanding, she simply said, "I already have." And just like that, she had the final word. For a moment, there was complete silence. The audience, the host, even the production team seemed frozen in place, absorbing Melania's final words. She had spoken with such certainty, such unwavering confidence, that there was no need for anything more. The host, who had spent the entire interview trying to push her into a corner, now found himself at a loss for words. He shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at his notes as if searching for something, anything to counter her. But there was nothing left to say. Melania remained composed, her expression calm. She had said everything she needed to, and now the weight of her words hung in the air. The audience, sensing the magnitude of the moment, hesitated before breaking into applause. It started as a ripple, and then swelled into a full standing ovation. Whatever people had expected from this interview, it wasn't this. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out, hadn't played into any of the typical media narratives. Instead, she had controlled the conversation from start to finish, proving that strength doesn't always come from speaking the loudest, but from knowing exactly when to speak at all. The host, realizing there was no recovering from this, forced a smile. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I think that's a good place to wrap things up." He turned slightly toward the camera, trying to maintain a sense of professionalism. Former First Lady Melania Trump, thank you for joining us today. Melania gave a small nod, offering nothing more. She didn't need to. As the cameras cut to a commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio remained charged. The host exhaled sharply, finally allowing himself to relax. He had gone into this interview expecting to take control, to lead the discussion where he wanted. Instead, Melania had flipped the entire dynamic. Backstage, the production team was already buzzing. Some whispered amongst themselves, others checked their phones, scrolling through live reactions pouring in online. The interview had barely ended, and yet the internet was already ablaze with clips, commentary, and headlines dissecting every word she had said. Some were calling it one of the most powerful interviews in recent memory. Others were stunned by how effortlessly she had handled the entire conversation. Melania, unfazed by the energy around her, gracefully made her way toward the exit. A few reporters, waiting just outside the studio doors, eagerly called out to her, hoping for an additional comment. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. Everything she had wanted to say was already out in the world, and now it was up to everyone else to make of it what they would. As she stepped into the car waiting for her, she finally allowed herself a small moment of reflection. She knew how the media worked. She knew they would spin the interview in every direction, analyzing every pause, every word, every shift in expression. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter. This time, the narrative wasn't being written for her. It was being written by her. Meanwhile, the host sat in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had conducted countless interviews in his career, had gone toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful figures in the world. But this one felt different. He hadn't just interviewed a former First Lady. He had faced someone who knew exactly how to handle the spotlight. Someone who had long been underestimated, but never truly understood. And now, as he replayed the conversation in his mind, he realized that no matter how hard he had tried, she had been the one in control all along. As the evening wore on, news outlets scrambled to react. Social media was flooded with reactions, with some praising Melania's composure and others speculating about what her words truly meant. People dissected every sentence, every gesture, debating whether she had hinted at something deeper or simply spoken her truth. But regardless of where they stood, one thing was certain: she had left an impact. The next morning, as headlines covered every angle of the interview, Melania remained exactly as she had been the night before, unbothered. She sipped her coffee, glancing briefly at the morning news. Clips of her interview played repeatedly, with commentators attempting to analyze her every word. But she didn't linger on it. She had done what she set out to do. She had spoken for herself, on her own terms. As the world continued to react, Melania simply carried on. The conversation would go on for days, weeks even, but she knew that eventually, the media would move on to the next story, the next controversy. That was the nature of the world she had lived in for so long. But this time, she had made sure that her voice, her message, wouldn't be forgotten. And as she stepped outside, the sun shining brightly, she allowed herself one final thought. No matter what people said, no matter how they tried to spin it, she had finally been heard.